Hello everyone, today we read and comment on the 8th paragraph of the second chapter of the second book of von Clausewitz, Vom Kriege, the title being Superiority of Numbers, and the text follows. The superiority in numbers being a material condition, it was chosen from amongst all the factors required to produce victory, because it could be brought under mathematical laws through combinations of time and space. It was thought possible to leave out of sight all other circumstances by supposing them to be equal on each side, and therefore to neutralize one another. This would have been very well if it had been done to gain a preliminary knowledge of this one factor according to its relations, but to make it a rule for ever to consider superiority of numbers as the sole law, to see the whole secret of the art of war in the formula in a certain time at a certain point to bring up superior masses, was a restriction overruled by the force of realities. So here continues our journey on von Clausewitz's historicistic approach to the explanation of the development of the theory of the art of war. And as you know, at this point, if you have listened to the other videos dedicated to the various paragraphs, we go step by step in this actually pretty anonymous chronology, for which von Clausewitz explains fundamentally how the theory of the art of war is developed without actually specifying in what times and places we're talking about. Obviously, this is, however, referred to essentially what Western Europe during the modern age, right? But it's something that can be applied to a big deal of other realities. Obviously, not with the same outcomes that would come into Western Europe. Take what the rest of the world didn't have a von Clausewitz but the point is that this evolution has to be understood also bearing in mind, in fact, the actual history of those times and places, and understanding why it came out. So here von Clausewitz talks fundamentally about this first take that this first element of superiority that surpasses all the others, that was originally taken in this primitive theory of the art of war, this newborn theory, or better, the attempts of creating a theory of the art of war, that is the superiority of numbers, numerical superiority, right? So in the previous paragraph, we've seen that at one point in this in the formulation, in a positive formulation of a theory of the art of war, the theorists basically gave up and said, you know what, this is impossible, it can't be done. So let's stick to something simpler that fundamentally has to do with the material side of the story, not with how things are really applied. So what von Clausewitz suggests here is evidently that the superiority of numbers was seen, given the attention to material elements, as this most important factor that had to be considered in function. And he says, okay, so superiority of numbers, and then he writes, the superiority in numbers being a material condition, it was chosen from amongst all the factors required to produce victory, because it could be brought under mathematical laws through combinations of time and space, right? So it had this main advantage that objectively, once you have this given quantity, you can say, I have it, whatever it is. It's men, it's horses, it's gunpowder, and this already complicated the story, because naturally, the superiority in numbers is mostly about actually fighting force properly meant, and we still in military history we say, what's superiority in numbers? It's essentially men fighting men, right? And but there is a deeper, already here, as you understand, a deeper view of the thing is that we take, I don't know, even plain numbers of men. Well, it doesn't tell you how many cannons there is in there. You have to specify it further, and you have to specify how these were put together. There is a further doctrine that informed this ratio, and the number of cavalry, etc. But as now we will see, von Clausewitz was explains that in those times the concept was, excuse me, fundamentally that all the other factors were given as somewhat specular, right? In the art of war, meaning that it was a bit of a self-referential system, right? Developing in Western Europe that essentially, Europeans fought more or less in the same ways at that point in Renaissance warfare, even later times, and this is a prejudice for which everything was considered like equal, right? It doesn't matter what kind of troops we're talking about, because more or less, hey, Europeans at this point fight in the same way, pike and shot, cavalry, and cannons, if you want to exclude them from the shot element. But we're talking about the same thing, and already this presents, in fact, many flaws, because aside from the fact that this was the moment in which Europeans ventured worldwide in their colonial adventures and meeting peoples that, albeit primitive, were also capable of defeating them on some occasion, and were evidently things like technology at that point did make a relevant difference, but there were in fact these matters of employment, right? Europe also has its own morphology, its own climate, its own characteristics, population dynamics. There are states, right? So there are massive infrastructural and logistical systems, and you can make it work. Fighting in North America or in India or in Africa, it depends. It changes a lot, relatively a lot, and therefore that complicated the story. Obviously, it helped in developing some sort of of deepening and expanding the theory of the art of war relatively, but fundamentally for European powers, the most important things going on were objectively on the European continent, right? Even if you take very late conflicts like the 7 Years' War, those were won, we can't say, abroad. Thinking about the clash between the French and the British in India, but still the main differences, or at least the main strengths involved at the end of the day, were still in Europe, right? And now we don't enter in detail. So this focused objectively, the theoretical speculation focused on this, substantially. I mean, in this war, European warfare was, not very, objectively not very asymmetrical, right? More or less. In fact, Europeans did fight, and would keep increasingly fight in similar fashion. And therefore, it was easier to say, more or less, everybody fights in the same way on that ground, and therefore, what matters is numbers. And then, yes, other qualities of command that were evidently recognized at one point, but that had escaped theorization because evidently they were too difficult to frame, and objectively up to von Clausewitz, we don't have a full framing of these elements into an organic theory that worked, that kept in mind the limits of a positivistic approach to the formulation of the same theory. So this idea of numbers is very seducing indeed, and you can understand this from the same way we study military history today. As I was saying before, we still look, at telling history of battles. There are so many compendiums about, the encyclopedia of battles, of warfare, and you go there and then you objectively can see that aside from date and place, some of the most important elements recorded. The first one actually, and that poses a great deal of problems even sometimes, but that in this sense shows how important that is, because you want to know that is the number of troops involved, right? And preferably also to know the type, to understand this better, this inner ratio of strengths, that are still fundamentally the key to understand certain things. And this is not, as we will see now, even from Clausewitz's thought, it's not really a huge deal. Von Clausewitz says that it could work in some fashion by great approximation, of course. But it's still a mistake that we tend to do, yes, but it's still also something that it's important to stress in the other sense, meaning that, for example, that war in general brings to an hybrid of military knowledge, for which you can say that peoples, especially that fought for a very long time together, they grow substantially similar, right? Asymmetry is something that you try to close in its gaps in a way that once you acknowledge that given your traditional warfare is not capable to cope with another one anymore because it's evidently superior in certain conditions, you try to find out new ways that obviously are, we shouldn't underestimate what are things that truly matter, and here we should introduce also the concept of Schwerpunkt, but it's a bit too long. It's not technology that makes the difference, but let's say that, for example, adaptation in weapons is a fundamental element you can see worldwide, and colonialism is very beautiful in this sense to study in its military history, because it shows you how quickly, but also how differently, several populations that had not known the Europeans and had lived, in different conditions, right? From primitive tribes to substantially advanced civilizations, reacted to European warfare and its invasive presence by essentially growing more similar to it, and how this learning was dramatically quick, and that tells you a lot, because it gives definitely importance to things like technology, but I think it shows you that transformation entailed way more than just using a weapon rather than another. It was really about changing a way of thinking war that is not easy, especially for certain groups that are used to certain different ways of conceiving the same fight, the same combat that unavoidably are going to change their society, right? We have, obviously, we're very concentrated as Westerners on the from the Western side of the story, also because most of the times that's the only side we know, because those peoples maybe didn't produce enough sources, or maybe because they were wiped out in certain occasions. But that, looking from the other side's perspective, are deep changes, or radical changes that now Europeans wouldn't undergo anymore, and that in this sense there was a more sedimented. The history of different areas of the world is interesting because there are civilizations that developed slowly. Europe, the Middle East, China, India, etc. are let's say peoples that are that didn't have massive crises. Like it's obvious that second half of the 19th century China had massive crisis due to European colonialism that appeared as something now that they couldn't cope with anymore. But up to the 18th century, objectively, the Chinese were the most powerful military existing in the world, and there were not massive changes. Like in Europe, the worst things we had were things like the Mongols, right? And they didn't basically even come to conquer Europe, so they were very distant and somewhat progressive transitions that even in places like the Middle East, where instead the Mongols came to raise everything to the ground and caused this massive psychological trauma, are still between peoples that are relatively symmetric, right? Well, when you start talking about, I don't know, Europeans going to New Zealand or Black Africa and starting to, but because also Black Africa, telling the truth, is very different from but in that case, or even with with Native Americans, you can see in there that there is a massive cultural shock. Think about what Mesoamerican warfare was about before the arrival of the Europeans, and how the local populations reacted to this new, not much just to the fact that they saw horses and guns that obviously they'd never seen, but to the same way, like even in front of linguistical or behavioral or attitudinal characters of the Europeans that for them were incomprehensible as much as for the Europeans some of their behaviors were incomprehensible. So problems that go far beyond, but that bring at the same time and over time, and in not such a long time, to an homogenization, right? To a quick adaptation of, maybe one day we will have to make a video on the adaptation of Northern American tribes to things like cavalry warfare and so on, because that is amazing. Like, it was the change of a whole continent, we can say, warfare in an incredibly quick way. And of course, because they entered in contact with the Europeans, but making most of the changes by themselves, right? And populations were traditionally sedentary, for example, transformed themselves into basically nomadic societies because they started breeding horses and using them on a type of there are many changes in this sense. Look even at, I don't know, you can find this on this is a difference of scale, right? These are things you find basically in every single conflict, because warfare is asymmetrical by definition all the time. Never trust people who tell you that there is such a thing like symmetric warfare, right? They're approximating in the wrong way, with the wrong with wrong terms. So there is always a change that is entailed. So we don't have to, just to come back to von Clausewitz, okay, we have to bear in mind that numbers are of course not everything, but bear in mind, however, that sometimes numbers in actual warfare do not reflect enormously different resources qualitatively speaking, right? In actual warfare, if there was such a qualitative difference, most conflicts would neither take place, right? There would be practically a every conflict that starts is usually bringing together certain military cultures in the middle and in its development. This is basically what it leads to, and therefore you can approximate by saying, okay, well, by saying that numbers matter because there are not such massive asymmetries between the fighters, right? And we have this tendency to, in fact, to look especially at combat in these terms, like saying, that there is a people that fought in a certain way, that it was very, very different from another one. So all we have to look at is that their actual combat, and presuming that they would remain in that fashion. But if you look at actual warfare throughout history, these two different types of warfare were actually coming to be much closer in actual combat. It really what made the difference at the end of the day were things that went far beyond combat and had to do with strategy, and all that entailed from, in terms of resources and other politics and culture and whatever, right? So it's sometimes difficult to talk about these topics in these terms, but it's still very important because it spares you from a lot of difficulties. Just today I was reading something like, the Vikings never, didn't use cavalry, and we found just a few longbows, and therefore, according to me, Vikings didn't fight nor with actual cavalry because they dismounted, and nor with longbow because there were just a few. Well, the most intelligent thing to say, since that the Vikings were in contact with basically they knew the horse since ever, and they and we can trace that. And they were surrounded by people, so it all made extensive use of cavalry, and longbows were spread since prehistory in Europe, basically everywhere. The point is, why shouldn't these guys be able to fight in that fashion? Especially, maybe I chose this small example. Actually, when you have sources that tell you that they did, really, so it's I made this example just for saying how we like to put their mechanicistic explanations by over stressing qualitative differences, right? So historically, those are less important than we think. And what von Clausewitz is trying to tell us here, even though it's implicit in his whole theory, maybe he's not actually expressing it now, but that's what he believed, is that it's not a matter of a quantity or quality that really makes the difference, but how you employ these quantities and qualities, which is a wholly different matter from saying it's just about quality or about quantity, or that warfare is played just on one level, and that's all what counts. And this is important because here von Clausewitz motivates what had pushed those military theorists during the modern age to choose amongst all factors required to produce victory numbers, because he says it could be brought under mathematical laws through combinations of time and space, right? In other words, you have a map, and you can put little flags and say let's concentrate forces here, and all you have to calculate at that point is how much time they're gonna take to go through that given space. So if you look at warfare, especially on a larger scale, you understand that from the top from the top, certain perspectives can look similar to these. Obviously, if you look at I don't know, the Eastern Front during World War II, you can rightly claim that there was a problem in there, in the miscalculation that the Nazis had made about the number of Soviet divisions, for example, and that they found out the hard way. Well, the invasion of the Soviet Union was already launched, and those were important things. Like, it's obvious that at that point numbers did make a difference, that also quality did make a difference, but overall it was other elements that we also have a great difficulty to trace, especially at this strategic level, because you have to take an enormous amount of other factors in there, about which we know very few, by the way, that are still debated today, but that at that point render things like quantity and quality not unimportant, but subordinated to, right? So and it's difficult, and I give you that, it's difficult conceptually speaking to try to frame this in a more comprehensive picture, multi-level pictures, and that's exactly what von Clausewitz teaches you, is that there is an intrinsic limit of our intellectual faculties to achieve something like that. We have problems to count and consider things like these, because our brain is fundamentally not suited for it. So we need enormous studies conducted for for lifetimes in order to find out certain things and how they went, and it's an increasing problem, right? The problem, even when it comes to military history, you can easily study, I would say, military history of the world from antiquity to the modern age without too many problems to tell it all. Especially ancient history is relatively easy to study. Things obviously increase, over time, increase in difficulty. But when you come to contemporary warfare, you realize that who can study profitably in this sense the 20th century comprehensively and understanding all the deeper implications of what conflicts like. I don't want to even say just the world wars that are obviously the biggest thing, but even conflicts like, I don't know, smaller ones, or even I don't know, the Soviet war in Afghanistan, the kind of a circumscribed thing, because it entails much more than we can think. And our take on this is somehow curious, because we tend to think that things that happen more recently are somehow easier to understand. Well, actually, this is not true. If anything, it's true the contrary, meaning that aside from the fact that obviously you can easily get rid of conceptions like I lived through those days, so I know how it's gone. No, you don't, because if you don't study these things thoroughly from sources, and no, you living in one moment doesn't tell you what the moment is. You can suffer as an individual, you can see some of the greatest horrors of war, but that doesn't give you any authority or competence or experience on what the bigger picture was from a political and military point of view, if you've never posed yourself even the problem to open a book and read that. Aside from that, I don't remember where I was going with this. Well, the fact that instead we look ancient medieval worlds like this difficult moments in history where everybody can still say something about it. We know everything. We know almost everything, right? We have to discover obviously a lot, but what we can know, it's not that we know everything about the absolute, but what we know in terms of those amount of sources that we have now, it's that. It stops to that fundamentally. So either archaeology, well, for Middle Ages, for certain centuries, of course, it's plenty of oceans of archives still to explore. So, but in the essentials, we are fairly sure that we will not rewrite medieval history or ancient history. Well, when it comes to contemporary history, and I don't want this to sound like a kind of a revisionistic attitude, but it's obvious that there are many topics of enormous importance that still are not properly studied. Still, the historiographies, for example, of certain countries are still have to begin to look at moments like, I don't know, the Cold War. So things that where people that of my age were into by certain standards. I came just to this world frankly just the extremely last moment. We can't even talk properly about the Cold War, but just for making you understand how lives that are so young are still basically still have to know a lot about what happened in their own countries, simply because a very few has been produced so far about certain things, and we will definitely expand this knowledge progressively. But think about the about it altogether, like what it is as a as a general effort to even make a synthesis out of it. An extremely useful exercise in this sense is to read a lot of manuals, right? If you don't have time to read, or if you don't have many books with you, but you can take simple manuals from libraries, etc., to confrontate them, and that's a quite useful exercise, because it shows you how easy it is to choose different ways to make a synthesis of history, right? How many perspectives you want to consider, not consider, when you have to make such big choices in terms of telling the history of, I don't know, 1,000 years, like the Middle Ages could have been, but more in general, how what even a school program basically is, and how easily you can influence entire generations just by writing something that maybe someone could say in another fashion. So obviously, as always, the best medicine for this is to read as much as possible, literally from everywhere. I mean, obviously, if you have access to better sources, to better use those. Do not you understand what I mean. But read continuously, right? And try to make some some further thought. Like you can read, but not maybe catching most of what truly matters. Try to be a bit more analytic. Try to pose yourself some questions and try to explain them by yourself. And you'll be surprised by how, because it all starts from your own mind. It started from the mind of the person who wrote that manual, to find even the proper words to talk about, to discuss about something. And it's very difficult, and it's also partly something we are losing, meaning that, I don't know, when I went to school, there was a lot of emphasis on knowing how to write well, like in saying something meaningful in an essay, and putting your thoughts together and saying in a somewhat complex fashion with logics and reason, making points, and that's something we don't seem to be interested in anymore. It's always more. Everything seems to be always more immediate, instinctual, emotional, right? And we are overly exposed to these things. It doesn't stop to, I don't know, to the way maybe history is taught in schools. I wouldn't know to tell it all whether history is taught better today in schools than when I went there, like 20 years ago. It's 20 years ago, 10 years ago, let's put it this way. Now I'm not so old. So and you may wonder how we arrived in here, but talking about von Clausewitz, but that's this paragraph is fundamentally a bit about being about approximations. What is that we have to approximate? And this is what the theorists of a certain point in history stop to. Numbers, right? Numbers, because it's an easy, it's literally a number. It's literally something you can write on paper that simply, and to quantify that simply, which evidently is not really like that, and it doesn't even take to enumerate all the other factors that can bring to the useless of numbers, moral, supplies, and it's basically environmental, so all what you can imagine can influence excuse me, at to wipe that force out, right, by itself. Doesn't matter how numerous it is. And von Clausewitz goes on saying, it was thought possible to leave out of sight all other circumstances by supposing them to be equal on each side, and therefore to neutralize one another. Now, as I was saying before, and maybe the next phrase is a bit more meaningful in this sense, because it says, von Clausewitz says, actually, this would have been very well if it had been done to gain a preliminary knowledge of this one factor according to its relations, right? This is important. That is to say, okay, well, number is a good starting point, right? Because objectively, as we've seen with the previous considerations about hybrid, right, warfare, and meaning hybrid, I don't like this term, but let's say with the hybridation that takes place in warfare all the time, of course, that rarely we have dramatically different forces fighting one another, right? So to make a bit of an apology, because this paragraph seems, this happens often with von Clausewitz, that you seem to read something that looks like an attack, right? J'accuse towards these theorists, but always remember that von Clausewitz is a fine historian, and he's not really criticizing them. He's criticizing, of course, the concepts that came up from that, but he's also making the effort to make us understand where these thoughts emerged from and how. And you have to contextualize them historically speaking. You don't have to read von Clausewitz thinking that you are a winner because you're learning from him. You have to learn from Clausewitz, knowing that most of what you got from previous experience is likely to be wrong, and by a very large margin. So these are all mistakes that we do, right? And this is not a matter of saying, speaking from the 21st century, from instead than the 19th or the 6th, right? This is a matter of understanding that we are humans, and as humans we tend to approximate certain things in a certain way, to continue making certain mistakes, right? So what von Clausewitz, according to me, here is pushing us to think is the nature of theorization itself. And bearing in mind what we said in the previous paragraphs, this may be more this is maybe easier to understand, because we have seen how theorists basically appear in the moment in which you start needing a better coordination of certain forces that, however, have already developed by themselves. As we have explained, it's not that when military theorization began, which, by the way, when did it begin? It existed even during the Middle Ages, in a minimal sense compared to the modern age, right? Excuse me. But there were already developed armed forces that functioned by themselves. That is, warfare went on in, let's say, in the best way possible. I don't want to sound too Leibnizian, but that's what happens among all human activities, best in war, because in war you have the highest pressure, so the results are basically the most rational that you can find in any other field of human action. Let's always bear in mind the difference between science and art in this sense. I mean, it's not that the two things are disconnected, it's that you have, science is about knowledge and art is about action, right? So von Clausewitz is telling you here it's not much a matter of gathering knowledge as such, which we can do. The problem is how to apply that. That's really the problem, because most of the times, first of all, we don't have knowledge, so that is enough to say, we're screwed. The second point is, though, what should we do about it in a positive fashion about this extremely negative situation, right? So this practical nature of warfare had always been there, even before military theorizations. Otherwise, you think like positivistic crazes in the 19th century, not only that there is an eternal progress of mankind that will bring us to who knows what, like immortality, but that there is that basically everybody who came before was a bunch of primitives with the clubs who didn't understand anything, they were too stupid, including medievals that made this kind of a irrational, emotional, and stupid warfare at the end of the day. This has never happened historically speaking. Warfare has always been something extremely sophisticated in every single historical epoch. Look at what medieval art of warfare actually was, and go tell me that wasn't developed or sophisticated. I mean, just look at what medieval logistics it was, or siege warfare it was about. But even just, pitched battles, as rare as they were, but, what those entailed, what kind of effort and coordination and an organization that required. So, aside from this, the concept here is that, paradoxically, and this, this mistake that von Clausewitz is talking about fundamentally is not a mistake of practice of the warfare of the time. It was a mistake of theory, but of a theory that in this sense has to be considered as absolute in positive terms, like the most positive one could be. I explain myself better. There are gross misunderstandings from a theoretical point of view, up to von Clausewitz. But the degree in which they intervene in actual warfare right? So in the way that warfare was actually fought, were proportionally reduced. Meaning what in turn? Meaning that, for example, this sticking just to numbers was functional, if you want, as a theory to what the political and military control was during the modern age. Right? If you had an army, so say you're the French king, and you want to send troops from, you to defend, I don't know, to besiege Namur in Belgium against the Habsburgs or whatever. And at that point, by the mid 17th century, what you need is not to have a dramatically sophisticated thinking of what quality involves, because the quality of your troops is maybe with the second half of the 17th century the theory had gone already a bit beyond this, but let's say that quality overall of your troops is already there, right? The way troops fight and they're trained and they and the character of war is really about is to be found with an effort, but objectively with a degree of homogeneity that you can find here and there, basically all over Europe at this point, that you don't really have to worry about, because there is someone there from the field that already knows how that has to work, right? So all you need is just to send your nobles, maybe not just as capable commanders, or maybe just because they were important political individuals, to be in charge of that army that, however, in part would also work kind of by themselves, right? And that's why theory was so primitive, because objectively there was a whole world about which we know a relatively few that was already capable of making those armies moving without requiring further theory, or in given the relative simplicity that those military instruments were about. So I know it's foggy probably because I didn't explain myself too effectively, but the concept is really simple to conceive, right? It's basically realizing that the need for something more advanced than simply saying, okay, we need a certain amount of troops in here is enough for that type of warfare as it was developed. And actually, I don't think that the example of the second half of the 17th century is wrong, because during, as you probably know already, by the actually I chose the best century actually to talk about, because up to the beginning of the 18th century, the Spanish Wars the War of Spanish Succession, the aim of most Western states was actually to bring numbers on the field. Think about all the, look at the Kingdom of France, that was the this kind of continental hegemonic power, and all the alliances basically of all the other European powers, almost all of them, against France, to do what? To make this enormous, gigantic, muscle to muscle, usually it was in fact in Belgium, sometimes in Germany, sometimes in Italy, to oppose numbers to numbers, because that objectively was the most functional way at that point to deal with the thing. This thing, however, brings to an enormous expanse, an enormous problem, and military technology still improves in a way for which, after this enormous war, European powers start saying, okay, well, let's reduce numbers and increase quality, right? So there is the further step at one point, right? But the origin from Renaissance warfare onwards had basically been about fielding more and more troops on the field. And objectively, the winner was the state that could bring on the field more troops at once, right? Because warfare, for the rest, was not substantially different from other state to state, and objectively what made the difference were numbers. You can see this also in medieval warfare, right? Or in many other warfare. This is I'm trying to make this a relative example, but this problem of numbers is present throughout all history of war. It doesn't stop to a moment in another, but it was particularly accentuated in this, let's say, early modern age, up to actually also later on a bit in time, throughout the 17th and beginning of the 18th century. Numbers do make the difference, and this was a problem that von Clausewitz had actually seen himself at one point, because also Napoleonic Wars had brought once again on a different principle, on a different political and social mechanism, the need of national armies, that is basically mass armies, like with hundreds of thousands on campaign at the same time throughout Europe. So, and that had changed. Why? Because during the 18th century, tendencies were to reduce. In fact, previously to the compared to what had been at the beginning of the century, right? Napoleonic Wars changed once again the thing, but not because it's a military tendency, but because it's obviously a political and social. It has political and social motives for that, right? As it's always the case in any moment you study war, it's always like that. And this is the Clausewitzian Trinity. So it's obvious that the 18th century represents, in this regard, a further step, because the realization that objectively numbers weren't everything does correspond to other changes in the art of war that were rendered possible politically, socially, and because new, to confine to military aspects, new technologies, new resources were rendering possible different kind of approaches to the enemy, right? So there are definitely moments in which one factor kind of expands over the others, right? Here there is not always a this is also important to understand. There's not always a direct, actually there's never properly a direct, perfect relation between what was happening on the battlefield, so in the practice of war, and in the theory of war, right? Most of the times the theory of war is, if it had to be applied literally, it would be a disaster on the field. Some of the most evident examples are, look at what World War the First was, right? There's this myth that obviously there was a kind of but throughout all war, basically there were wrong ideas, and this is completely false, actually, from an historical point of view. World War the First had necessarily to be fought in that way or not fought, right? There were not differences. Trench warfare is not a matter of doctrinal illiteracy. World War the First warfare was one of the most radically sophisticated and advanced warfare that mankind had ever seen, right? So the problem, though, was at the beginning, where basically everybody, by the summer of 1914, where the war broke out, was convinced that fundamentally there would have not been a warfare of that, like trench warfare, right? So that's a brilliant example to see how theory of war from states that now, we're talking about, the end of the 19th century, the beginning of the 20th century, had developed including with Clausewitzian theory, massive critical capabilities and understanding of military mechanisms, but at that point I had made some gross miscalculation about what things would turn out like. Then this gap was filled in basically 2 or 3 months of warfare, where after which basically every nation involved in the war knew perfectly that things were different, right? So the myth that the bloodshed happened because generals were stupid, and looking at smartphones in the 21st century are instead is just a childish thought. The concept is, however, that there are definitely fluctuations between the way we conceive warfare theoretically and how it is really like. And history in this sense has showed us that the more our societies are complex, and the more this risk is high. That is, in other words, there is not also in here a proportional, a directly proportional measure, right? But let's say that the more, let's put it mathematically speaking, the more the system is complex, and the more it's difficult to decipher it. And you can't decipher it in the first place, but in trying to understand, to predict how it will evolve, right? So paradoxically, more primitive warfare is much easier to make it work correctly from a theoretical point of view than it is a way more advanced warfare, right? Which in other words is, medievals, for example, were much more capable of making their military work in relative terms than we are capable of making our military work in relative terms. Do you understand this? This is very important to understand, because it shows you how careful we have to be with the military instrument. Which doesn't mean, okay, let's not use it. No, it doesn't work like that. Of course, war most of the time is not the best option. It's just the quickest one. But sometimes you do have to use violence, and when you do, you must know how it works, because the effects can be devastating. This is what von Clausewitz is teaching you in absolute terms. He's not telling you, von Clausewitz doesn't say, not even once in here, that you have to fight, that war is good, that you have to make an apology for it. It doesn't work like that. Von Clausewitz is telling you that whether you like it or not, sometimes you will have to use war. And if you want to get through it the right way, you have at least if you hope to want that, you have to absolutely know most as possible how it works and what it is, right? Because that's already a steady base. You can start building the calculation, right, of how that can be. So it's not a guarantee of success, but it's the necessary, inescapable base from which you have to start in order to start making things work. This is of enormous importance, and if we only studied von Clausewitz, if we only had a culture about these topics, if only we understood the importance of this thinker, instead of presuming that we have passed it by because 21st century warfare, it's so different, because von Clausewitz was writing from the 19th century, so instead now we're so more advanced. No, war is literally the same thing, because it's always the same thing. It doesn't matter how you fight it. It's war that works in a certain way. And as long as you don't understand that, you can make macroscopic mistakes. And we can see it basically every day how that happens. So, and it involves everything. It doesn't just involve the military. You think it involves military. This involves each and every one of us. It involves politics. It involves society. You can't say, our politicians are a bunch of idiots because they do wrong things. You can maybe think about that if you're living in a totalitarian regime, but not even there, because still you have some power that you don't even use because you want to trade for security. So, but especially in democracies where we live, what the hell? let's build kind of strategic culture people-wide in order to prevent, at least, to have a debate in the first place. It's dramatic how in Western countries we're not able as societies to even have a talk about things like strategic culture. Chatting about bullshit and doing nothing about what truly matters in these regards, and which is not a matter of saying how many people will die eventually in that war, but what kind of political, social, economical consequences this will have worldwide. That's what we are hardly wired to at this point, at every level, right? So it seems as if we arrived to this top of civilization after millennia of struggles to say, okay, so now we can relax. No, it doesn't work that way. It's the same exact opposite. A Neolithic peasant of 3000 BC could be fairly, not careless about what its world would evolve like, because that wasn't evolving a big deal after all. Now it's the time in which we have to be most careful in absolute terms, and we are not. So this is a recipe for disaster. And I don't want to sound like those prophets of doom that say, the world, the end is near. But we are actually seeing how costly these mistakes are. So why don't we reconsider certain things, or start to consider them in the first place? Because most people don't even know that these problems exist. But getting to the point, which you wonder, how would you digress in this? There was a fair, and this is what von Clausewitz, in my opinion, is implicitly saying through the lines, is that objectively, for the time in which this theory that was given importance usually to numbers was developed, objectively you could definitely not think that it was all what mattered, but let's say that generally speaking, warfare was fought in a fundamentally homogeneous way, for which you could definitely apply way our means to win a war, but that when it took to the essentials of the troops, for example, they quite, there wasn't much to formulate further that wasn't already known from the field and developed with military practice from commanders that you could find, and that in this sense you didn't even need to train yet properly, because military careers always existed even before the foundation of military academies, right? So also in this sense, things started developing where it was understood that there was a need for improving this, which didn't derive from the acknowledgement that such matters existed in the first place, because the complexity of these systems that was requiring it in order to manage better the same. So von Clausewitz says this would have been we have read it, but we'll repeat it. This would have been very well if it had been done to gain a preliminary knowledge of this one factor according to its relations, but to make it a rule for ever to consider superiority of numbers as the sole law, to see the whole secret of the art of war in a formula, in a certain time, at a certain point, to bring up superior masses, was a restriction overruled by the force of realities, right? And this is also self-explanatory, I would say. So von Clausewitz is saying, okay, that was objectively, maybe at the time, the most important thing. Numbers were maybe the most important factor at one point, because still one of the biggest problems was to even be able to field such numbers. Also, let's stress this point, that this is a moment in which modern states are developing, and they mostly developed around the effort of fielding armies. ever larger armies. Because guess what? There's an intrinsic superiority in that point, as we've seen in conditions of relative symmetry, that make force. That will probably a matter of amount of strength, right? And it's pretty understandable. But you can't think that this was the most that this was and could be in every age the most important factor ever. You don't need much else. So here from Clausewitz is essentially saying, okay, we can start from that, but always assuming that you have to know what this number means, right? How many are these troops? Fine, but how equipped are they? How trained are they? How what's their morale at this point? What's their equipment in terms of what's their function also? What kind of troops they are in the first place in terms of tactical specialty. What is that and these problems sometimes were rendered, as we've seen, not unimportant, but let's say that there could be a few that could be done about it, because still this was a moment of transition. For example, this is also important, from mercenary armies to standing, like let's say, regular armies. So it's obvious that the mercenary is the best example here, because they already knew what to do, and you hired these companies because they already knew how to fight. So there is a great transformation. There is a great effort, of course, to start maintaining the strengths on the field, and that's where things start to change. Because as long as when the problem is having the difference is made by having more troops than someone else at one time, obviously the one has most centralized control wins. But also in here, it doesn't happen so quickly, right? In Europe, there is not immediately this immense asymmetry for which, there are big things. Speaking about the wars of Italy, and what the difference that it made for states like France, for example, or Spain, even though it wasn't quite a state, but still a sum of kingdoms, but it was functioning like one theoretically. It made in front of the Italian signories that were all, kind of even powerful powers on their own, but they were kind of small and divided, fragmented. So you can spot these differences, but you understand that also these differences were overall low throughout all the time. So there is not a moment in which even this superiority numbers was probably ever emphasized as literally the most important thing. Sometimes it was just about pushing, about on a front that was deemed as weak, or understanding that seizing one position could be obtained with this huge display of force. Then over time, even from the other side, when war progressively tends to centralize, right? Continuous warfare brings to the necessity of societies to have a more direct control on all of their assets, right? So progressively, certain strengths could be balanced, for example, by alliances, because overall the troops that were fielded were still, could compete. It was force answering to other force, just like an algebraic sum. And it's at that point that you start needing something else, that you start realizing that numbers are not everything, because force to force can be countered physically, but you start to use other more sophisticated means that involve a different use of your military resources, right? So theory of art of war, and in a more sophisticated fashion. So this is what would happen. And for now, von Clausewitz doesn't talk about this, but he stresses importantly enough that this formula in a certain time, in a certain point, to bring up superior masses at a certain point by itself doesn't hold. It had never quite literally functioned that way, and over time it was restricted. It was eventually overruled by the force of realities. That is, what's really the how you learn that this is not the case in the hardest way throughout factors that you have to cope with and you cannot keep excluding from the theory, just because it's difficult, right? So this is very important, and it would evolve naturally, as we know, more sophisticated thinking. And it's important to stress in here that, as we will see now, that there were that all of these thoughts were developed progressively, that not all states came to the same not much to the same conclusions, but to the capability of applying of applicating them, right? And that therefore this theory evolved very, very slowly. It was a non-linear process, right? So it was a sum of various currents that progressively sedimented, and some others were built upon them. So that's why von Clausewitz cleverly stays out from saying, oh, this happened in this year, this in this other, and it happened in this country or in another. It's how the mentality evolved overall relatively to this matter, and it's what objectively we need to know without too many to the ends of the Vom Kriege, without too many further complications, right? Because here we can afford not to have them. Alright, so okay, from next time we will talk about victualling of troops. And for now, I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, or always leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.